The day an HOA woman tried to invoice me for the air above my own house was the day I realized insanity does not need permission, it only needs a clipboard, a fake badge, and enough confidence to knock on your door. She stood there smiling like she had just discovered gravity, waving a printed notice that claimed I owed money for something I could not see, could not touch, and did not believe any human could legally own. I laughed at first. That was my mistake. I live on the edge of a quiet residential strip that backs up to a small private airfield, the kind with one runway, a hangar that smells like oil and sun-baked aluminum, and a handful of pilots who treat flying like therapy. I bought the place years ago because of the open sky. No tall buildings, no power lines in the way, just clean horizon and the low rumble of prop engines now and then. It was peaceful. It was perfect. And apparently, according to the HOA president, it was taxable. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. She introduced herself with a laminated badge that said HOA Compliance Officer, even though I knew for a fact the HOA did not have such a position. She spoke in rehearsed sentences, each one delivered with a smug upward tilt of her chin. She told me she was conducting a routine compliance review. I asked her what exactly she was reviewing. She gestured upward. She explained that the HOA had recently updated its community guidelines to include airspace usage. I thought she was joking. She was not. She claimed that because my property sat near the airfield, and because small aircraft sometimes flew over my roof during approach or departure, I was benefiting from shared airspace and therefore owed usage fees to the association. She said it slowly, as if that would make it make sense. I told her airspace belonged to the federal government. She smiled wider. She said that might be true for high-altitude airspace, but low-altitude airspace was a gray area. She loved that phrase, gray area. She said the HOA lawyer had confirmed it. I asked to see that confirmation. She tapped the clipboard and said it was confidential. I closed my door. She knocked again. Harder. When I opened it the second time, she handed me a printed invoice. It had my name spelled wrong and a total that made my stomach flip. Airspace utilization fee. Retroactive charges included. Late penalties applicable. I asked her if she was serious. She said deadly serious and reminded me that failure to pay could result in fines, liens, or loss of community privileges. I asked what privileges. She said compliance. I told her to leave my property. She wrote something down and said she would note my refusal. Then she pointed upward again and said the meter was already running. That night I called my friend Mark, who keeps his single-engine plane in the hangar down the road. Mark is a licensed pilot with thousands of flight hours and a laugh that shakes walls. I told him what happened. He laughed for a full 30 seconds without stopping. Then he stopped laughing and got very quiet. He asked me to keep the invoice. Over the next week, Karen escalated. She mailed letters. She taped notices to my mailbox. She even placed a small orange stake near my driveway with a tag that read airspace boundary marker. That was the moment the humor drained out of it. Neighbors started asking questions. Some laughed. Some got nervous. Karen started holding impromptu meetings on the sidewalk, explaining her vision of community-managed airspace. She spoke about safety, harmony, and fairness while waving her arms like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. Then she crossed a line. One afternoon I heard a knock that was not a knock but a demand. Karen stood there with two men I had never seen before. One wore a polo shirt with the HOA logo. The other carried a handheld device that looked suspiciously like a laser range finder. She announced they were there to conduct an airspace survey. I asked what exactly they planned to survey. She said vertical trespass. She claimed planes flying over my roof were dipping too low and violating HOA-controlled airspace. She said she had already issued warnings to the airfield. She said if non-residents continued to use community airspace without authorization, the HOA would pursue enforcement actions. I asked what enforcement actions. She said cease and desist notices, fines, and possibly grounding requests. That was the moment I realized this was no longer just absurd. It was dangerous. I told her to get off my property immediately. She refused. She said she had authority. I asked her to show it. She waved the clipboard again. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Her smile tightened. She told me recording without consent violated HOA policy. I told her trespassing violated state law. They left, but not before she leaned in and told me this was just the beginning. She said airspace regulation was the future and pioneers always faced resistance. That evening, Mark came over. He read every notice, every invoice, every made-up regulation. He did not laugh this time. He explained exactly how airspace worked. He explained federal preemption. He explained navigable airspace, minimum safe altitudes, and how no HOA on Earth had jurisdiction over it. Then he said something that made me grin. He said he wanted to talk to someone. 2 days later, Karen scheduled a community meeting. The topic was airspace compliance. She invited residents, HOA board members, and representatives from the airfield. She did not expect pilots to show up. She definitely did not expect uniforms. When Mark told me he was bringing friends, I assumed he meant other pilots. I did not realize one of those friends worked as an aviation safety inspector and another had logged more flight hours than Karen had spent breathing air she thought she owned. As I walked toward that meeting, invoice folded in my pocket, I realized something important. Karen did not just misunderstand the law. She believed reality itself could be rewritten if she spoke loudly enough. And she was about to discover that the sky does not belong to confidence, paperwork, or fantasy. It belongs to facts. And pilots. Karen arrived at the community meeting like she was stepping onto a stage she had rehearsed for weeks. She wore a navy blazer that looked one size too stiff, carried the same clipboard like a scepter, and positioned herself at the front of the folding tables as if gravity itself bent toward her authority. The room smelled like burnt coffee and plastic chairs. Neighbors filtered in with confused expressions, some curious, some already annoyed. I sat near the back, quiet, invoice still folded in my pocket, watching her scan the room with the confidence of someone who believed the ending was already written. She opened the meeting by thanking everyone for attending such an important discussion about safety and shared resources. That phrase again. Shared resources. She clicked a remote and a projector flickered on, throwing a crooked slide onto the wall. It showed a cartoonish diagram of houses with dotted lines rising into the sky. Above them, a shaded block labeled HOA managed airspace. A few people laughed. Karen did not. She explained that increased air traffic posed risk, noise, liability, property values. She said the HOA had a responsibility to protect residents from unregulated aerial activity. She said fees were not punishment but participation. I raised my hand. She ignored it. She talked about fairness and control and how progress always upset people who refused to adapt. Then she said my name. She gestured toward me and explained that one homeowner had already refused to comply. She said refusal did not exempt anyone from responsibility. Eyes turned toward me, some sympathetic, some irritated that this had anything to do with them. I stood up anyway. I asked her to explain, clearly, what legal authority the HOA had over navigable airspace. The room went quiet. Karen smiled like she had been waiting for that question. She said the HOA lawyer had assured her they were operating within a legal gray area. She said until challenged in court, policy stood. She said if people wanted to avoid conflict, compliance was the simplest solution. That was when the door opened. Mark walked in first, calm and relaxed, wearing his pilot jacket like it was just another Tuesday. Behind him came 2 men and a woman I did not recognize. They did not look like angry neighbors or bored homeowners. They looked official without trying to. One of them carried a slim folder. Another wore a pin I recognized from the FAA website Mark had shown me the night before. Karen paused mid-sentence. Her smile flickered, then reset. She asked who they were. Mark spoke before anyone else could. He said they were guests. He said they were here because Airspace had been mentioned. He said when people start charging fees for something governed by federal law, professionals tend to get curious. Karen's tone sharpened. She said only residents and HOA representatives were permitted to speak. The woman with the pin stepped forward and introduced herself calmly. She said she worked in aviation safety oversight. She said she was there in an observational capacity. She did not raise her voice. She did not smile. She did not need to. Karen tried to recover. She said the HOA welcomed expert opinions. She said collaboration was always the goal. She gestured back to her slide and continued talking about low-altitude control. That was when Mark interrupted her. He asked her to define low altitude. She hesitated. She gave a vague answer about anything below commercial flight path. Mark nodded and asked if she was aware of minimum safe altitude regulations for small aircraft. She said that was irrelevant. He asked if she knew that private property owners did not own the air above their homes beyond immediate use. She said the HOA bylaws extended property interests upward. He asked her if bylaws overruled federal aviation law. She did not answer that. The room shifted. People leaned forward. Someone whispered. Karen's voice grew louder. She accused Mark of intimidation. She accused the airfield of negligence. She accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign. I sat there quietly, watching the structure she built out of confidence start to wobble. The man with the folder finally spoke. He said he had reviewed the notices Karen sent to the airfield. He said they were legally meaningless. He said the HOA had no authority to issue cease and desist letters regarding flight operations. He said attempts to interfere with aircraft operations could be considered a serious violation. Karen laughed, sharp and brittle. She said that sounded like a threat. The woman with the pin corrected her. She said it was not a threat. She said it was a fact. Karen snapped back that the HOA had a duty to protect its residents. The woman replied that aviation safety existed precisely to prevent unqualified individuals from making dangerous decisions based on personal belief. She said charging fees for airspace could mislead residents into thinking the HOA had powers it did not. She said that kind of misinformation caused problems. Karen slammed her clipboard onto the table. She said the HOA board stood behind her. She said she had vote. She said this community would not be bullied by outsiders. That was when a neighbor stood up. Then another. One asked if Karen had actually consulted a real aviation attorney. Another asked why invoices were being issued without a vote. Someone else asked if liens could really be placed over imaginary space. Karen tried to answer them all at once. Her words tangled. Her authority thinned. I finally stood up again. I told the room that I did not enjoy being the center of this. I told them I loved living here. I told them I believed rules mattered when they made sense and protected people. Then I held up the invoice. I asked if anyone else had received one. No hands went up. I asked Karen why I was the first. She said pilot traffic passed over my house most frequently. Mark cleared his throat. He said that was because the approach path predated the HOA by decade. He said moving it was not an option. He said pretending otherwise was dangerous. Karen looked around and realized something too late. This was no longer her meeting. This was a reckoning. She gathered her papers and announced the meeting was adjourned. People ignored her. Conversations erupted. Questions flew. Karen pushed past Mark and the inspectors and left the room with her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. As the crowd thinned, the woman with the pin approached me. She said quietly that if Karen continued this behavior, there would be consequences. She said interfering with flight operations was not a joke. She said documenting everything was smart. Mark clapped me on the shoulder and grinned. He said that was just the opening act. I watched the door Karen had stormed through and felt something settle in my chest. She had not backed down. She had retreated. And people like her never retreat without planning the next move. Karen did not disappear after that meeting. She multiplied. The first sign was a notice taped to the community bulletin board the next morning, printed in bold letters and laminated like a warning label. It announced the formation of an Airspace Oversight Committee. Chairperson listed as Karen. Emergency authority cited. No vote mentioned. No board signatures. Just her name and that same confident tone that assumed reality would fall in line if it was formatted correctly. By noon, the airfield manager called me. His voice was tight in a way I had never heard before. He said Karen had emailed every address she could find. She accused pilots of reckless descent. She accused the airfield of violating community safety agreements that did not exist. She attached screenshots of her cartoon diagram like it was evidence. She demanded immediate compliance or she would escalate to higher authorities. The irony was painful. She thought she was the authority. That afternoon she showed up again. This time she did not knock. She stood on the sidewalk just off my driveway with a bright yellow vest and a handheld radio clipped to her chest like cosplay. 2 orange cones sat near the edge of the road. Not blocking anything yet. Just close enough to be a message. She told me she was conducting a visual safety assessment. She told me she had received complaints. She told me she was documenting repeated overflight violations. I asked who complained. She said concerned resident. I asked for names. She said privacy rules applied. She loved rules when they served her. A single-engine plane passed overhead, low but perfectly legal, its shadow gliding across the asphalt like a reminder of how small she was. Karen flinched and started speaking into her radio, reporting the aircraft like it had just robbed a bank. I watched her describe altitude and direction with complete confidence and absolutely no understanding of what she was saying. That was when I noticed the camera. She had set up a tripod across the street, angled upward, recording the sky. A handwritten label taped to it read HOA Airspace Monitoring Unit. I asked if she had a permit to film private property. She said the sky was public. She said angles were irrelevant. She said everything above the fence line was fair game. I called Mark again. He did not sound surprised. Within 2 days, letters went out to residents warning of potential liability risks tied to unauthorized aircraft activity. Karen claimed insurance premiums could rise. She claimed property values could fall. She claimed homeowners might be personally exposed if they failed to support enforcement measures. Fear was her fuel. And it worked on some people. A neighbor stopped me while I was taking out the trash. He asked if planes were really allowed to fly that low. He asked if Karen might be right. I told him the truth. I explained approach paths and regulations. He nodded but did not look convinced. Doubt spreads faster than facts when it wears a vest and carries a clipboard. Then Karen escalated again. One evening, just before sunset, I heard the sound of plastic scraping asphalt. I stepped outside and saw cones. Not near the driveway. Across it. 4 of them, evenly spaced, like a line she had finally decided to cross. A laminated sign hung from a folding stand. Temporary safety closure. Airspace hazard assessment in progress. I laughed once. A short, sharp sound. Then I felt angry. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She told me access was temporarily restricted for safety reasons. She told me she had authority under emergency provisions. I asked her what emergency. She pointed upward again and said risk was ongoing. I told her to move the cones. She refused. She said if I interfered, she would document noncompliance. She said fines would escalate. She said enforcement would follow. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Again. She noticed this time. She squared her shoulders and spoke louder, addressing the camera like it was a jury. She said she was acting in the best interest of the community. She said reckless homeowners endangered everyone. She said she would not be intimidated. A car approached from down the street. Karen waved it to a stop, explaining the closure. The driver looked confused, then annoyed, then suspicious. He asked who authorized this. Karen pointed at her vest. He shook his head and reversed slowly, like he was backing away from something unstable. That night, Mark came over with someone else. A man named Tom who had flown military transports before retiring into quiet civilian route. He listened while I explained everything. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said one sentence. "She is going to get someone hurt." The next morning proved him right. A student pilot on final approach aborted his descent when he saw movement near the approach path. Karen and her committee, which was really just her and one confused board member, had placed reflective markers near the fence line. She called them visual warnings. The pilot saw unexpected ground signals and pulled up hard, narrowly avoiding a dangerous maneuver close to stall speed. The airfield shut down operations for an hour. That was the moment the tone changed. Phones rang. Emails flew. The woman with the pin from the meeting called me directly. Her voice was calm but clipped. She asked me to send every photo, every video, every notice. She asked me if Karen had physically obstructed access. I said yes. She asked if aircraft operations had been affected. I said yes. She paused. Then she said thank you. Karen did not know any of this yet. She was still operating in her bubble of self-appointed power, still believing escalation meant control. That afternoon she sent a final notice to the community. Emergency enforcement measures would continue until compliance was achieved. She warned of fines. She warned of consequences. She ended it with a line that made my jaw tighten. Non-cooperation will be treated as willful endangerment. Mark read it and smiled in a way that made me uneasy. He said she had just crossed from absurd into actionable. He said the fantasy was about to meet paperwork that actually mattered. As the sun set and another plane passed safely overhead, I realized Karen had spent so long pointing at the sky that she never noticed what was happening on the ground. She thought she was building authority. What she was really building was a case. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, slipped under my door like a threat that did not want to be seen. It was thicker than the others and stamped with language Karen clearly believed made it official. Notice of non-compliance. Emergency assessment findings. Immediate corrective action required. She had learned that stacking words made her feel powerful, even when none of them meant anything. This time she was not just charging fees. She was ordering changes. She demanded I install visual obstruction markers on my roof. Bright reflective panels. She claimed they would alert pilots to community-controlled zones. She demanded I sign an acknowledgement accepting shared liability for future overflights. She gave me 72 hours. She ended the notice with a warning that refusal would trigger enforcement proceedings. I read it twice. Then I laughed. Then I stopped laughing. Because the next page was worse. She had attached a draft agreement. It claimed homeowners consented to HOA oversight of airspace-related activities. It referenced fines, access restrictions, and cooperation with monitoring efforts. It used legal language, just clean enough to scare people who did not know better. And at the bottom, she had already typed my name. I called Mark. He came over with Tom and another pilot named Elena who flew medevac helicopters. They spread the papers out on my kitchen table like evidence from a crime scene. Elena read quietly, her jaw tightening with every paragraph. When she finished, she said something that made the room go silent. If someone had put those markers on a roof during one of my night approaches, it could have killed someone. That was when fear finally cut through the absurdity. Not fear of Karen. Fear of consequences. That afternoon Karen escalated in person. She arrived with a county code enforcement officer. At least, that is what she claimed he was. The man stood awkwardly at the end of my driveway while Karen did all the talking. She said she had filed a safety complaint. She said she had authority to request inspections. She said refusal would be documented. The man avoided eye contact and shifted his weight like he wanted to be anywhere else. I asked him directly who he worked for. He hesitated. He said he was contracted to review safety concerns. I asked which department. He said community services. Karen jumped in and said introductions were unnecessary. I asked to see identification. Karen snapped that I was obstructing an official process. I repeated the request. The man finally produced a badge. It was real. But it was not what Karen implied. He was not there to enforce anything. He was there to observe. When I explained what had been happening, his expression changed. He asked Karen if she had placed ground markers near an active approach path. She said yes proudly. She said it demonstrated proactive governance. He asked if she had coordinated with aviation authorities. She said the HOA was not required to. He took note. Karen noticed and bristled. She accused me of manipulating the situation. She accused pilots of exaggeration. She accused everyone except herself. The officer told her calmly that interfering with flight operations was outside HOA jurisdiction. He told her placing unauthorized markers could violate safety regulations. He told her this was serious. She waved him off. She said the HOA would handle it internally. She said external interference was unwelcome. She said she had documentation proving necessity. She tried to hand him her clipboard. He did not take it. That evening, the airfield received a formal notice from a federal office. Temporary monitoring. Compliance review. Investigation initiated. It was written in the kind of language that does not argue. Karen responded by doubling down. She emailed residents warning them of government overreach. She framed the investigation as retaliation for standing up for community right. She urged unity. She urged trust. She urged people to stop talking to outsiders. Some believed her. Most did not. The next morning, a white SUV with official markings parked near the airfield. Then another. Inspectors walked the perimeter. They spoke to pilots. They took photos of Karen's markers and cones. They asked questions she could not answer. She tried to intervene. She told them they needed HOA approval. She told them this was private community space. One of them listened politely. Then he told her federal authority did not require HOA consent. She raised her voice. She demanded names. She demanded paperwork. She demanded respect. They handed her a card. I watched from a distance as she read it. Her posture changed. Just slightly. The clipboard dipped. The vest did not look as impressive anymore. That afternoon, Mark received a call. He put it on speaker so I could hear. The voice on the other end thanked him for reporting the situation. The voice said the matter was being handled. The voice said any further interference would carry consequences. Karen still did not stop. She sent one last message to the community that night. She claimed she was being targeted. She claimed this was proof she was right. She claimed backing down would set a dangerous precedent. But the language had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place was defensiveness. Fear disguised as confidence. As I lay in bed listening to a plane pass overhead, steady and safe, I realized something important. Karen had always believed authority came from pretending long enough that no one would challenge her. Now she was being challenged by people who did not pretend. And she was running out of places to point her finger except at the sky, which had never listened to her in the first place. Karen went quiet for 3 days. No emails. No notices. No cones. No clipboard patrols. The silence felt wrong, like the moment after a storm when the air still vibrates. Neighbors noticed it too. People started whispering again, this time with relief instead of fear. Someone joked that the sky had finally been reclaimed. I did not laugh. Silence was not surrender. It was planning. On the 4th day, the HOA board called an emergency session. The notice appeared in inboxes just after dawn. Mandatory attendance. Critical governance matters. Community safety vote. The language was neutral, but the timing was not. Karen had waited just long enough for people to think the problem was fading. Then she pulled them back in. I went. The meeting room was packed. Board members sat stiffly at the front, eyes darting between papers and each other. Karen sat among them this time instead of standing. That alone told me something had shifted. She did not wear the vest. She wore a dark suit. The clipboard was gone. In its place was a thick binder. She opened by thanking the board for their courage. She said difficult decisions required strong leadership. She said outside pressure had attempted to undermine community autonomy. She said tonight was about reclaiming control. Then she unveiled her next move. She proposed an amendment. Not a policy. An amendment to the HOA bylaws. It would formalize an airspace compliance authority within the association. It would authorize fees, monitoring, enforcement coordination, and emergency measures. It would require homeowner cooperation. It would protect board members from personal liability. It would retroactively validate actions already taken. She framed it as defensive. She framed it as necessary. She framed it as the only way forward. The room reacted immediately. Some people murmured in agreement. Others shook their heads. One board member asked if legal counsel had reviewed the amendment. Karen said yes. She did not say who. Another asked if federal aviation law had been considered. She said that was beyond the HOA's scope. I raised my hand. She saw me and looked away. A resident stood up and asked why the board was voting on something that had already triggered an investigation. Karen snapped that fear could not dictate governance. She said backing down now would be admitting fault. She said the HOA had to stand firm. The board chair finally spoke. He looked tired. He asked if anyone had received official notice regarding the investigation. Karen said that was confidential. He asked if the amendment would expose residents to liability. Karen said unity reduced risk. Mark was sitting beside me. He leaned forward and whispered that this was the move he had been waiting for. He told me to let it happen. The board opened the floor for comment. That was when Elena stood up. She introduced herself calmly. She said she was a medevac pilot. She said she flew night operations over residential areas. She said unexpected markers and unauthorized ground signals could cause fatal errors. She said she had seen it happen. She said people died. The room went quiet. Karen accused her of emotional manipulation. Elena did not react. She said facts did not need emotion. She said pilots trusted that the ground would not lie to them. Another pilot spoke. Then another. One explained approach paths. One explained minimum altitude. One explained federal oversight. None of them raised their voices. None of them attacked. They simply explained. Karen tried to regain control. She accused them of colluding. She accused them of threatening property values. She accused them of ignoring community concerns. Then someone else stood up. It was a homeowner who had been on Karen's side early on. He said he supported safety. He said he believed her at first. Then he said he had called his insurance company. He said they told him any HOA interference with aviation could void coverage. He said he was not willing to risk his house for a fantasy. That word landed hard. Fantasy. The board chair rubbed his temples. He asked for a recess. The room buzzed with conversation. Karen sat rigid, flipping through her binder like the right page might still save her. During the break, my phone buzzed. A message from the woman with the pin. She said she had heard about the amendment. She said passing it would escalate matters significantly. She said the association could face consequences. When the meeting resumed, the board chair cleared his throat. He said the amendment would not be voted on tonight. He said further legal review was required. He said the investigation could not be ignored. Karen stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She accused the board of cowardice. She accused them of betrayal. She accused residents of being manipulated by outsiders. Then she said something that sealed her fate. She said if the board refused to act, she would. She said she would enforce compliance herself. The room erupted. People shouted. The chair banged the table. Karen gathered her binder and stormed out, declaring she would not let bureaucracy endanger lives. Mark leaned back and exhaled slowly. He said she had just publicly claimed authority she did not have. He said that was not bravado. That was evidence. As I walked out into the night air, I looked up. The sky was clear. A plane crossed overhead, steady and safe. Karen had tried to turn air into power. Now she was running out of ground to stand on. And she did not realize the fall was about to be very public. Karen made good on her threat within 48 hours. I woke up to the sound of engines idling outside my house. Not aircraft. Trucks. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop. 2 pickup trucks were parked near the curb. The HOA logo was magnet to the doors. Karen stood between them, issuing instructions like a general. Behind her were ladders, cones, and a stack of reflective panels wrapped in plastic. She did not knock this time. She walked straight toward my front door with paperwork in hand. I stepped outside before she could reach it. She announced that the HOA was conducting emergency safety modifications. She said the board's delay constituted negligence. She said she was acting under implied authority to prevent harm. She said refusal would be documented as obstruction. I told her to leave my property. She said this was no longer a request. One of the men started unloading ladders. I told him to stop. He hesitated and looked at Karen. She nodded. He kept going. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Karen saw it and smiled. She said documentation protected everyone. She said I was finally cooperating. I called the non-emergency number while standing there. I explained calmly that unauthorized individuals were attempting to alter my property and interfere with aviation safety. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in danger. I looked at the ladders pointed toward my roof and said yes. Karen scoffed. She said law enforcement would side with the HOA. She said they always did. The first patrol car arrived fast. The officer stepped out and took in the scene. Trucks, ladders, cones. A woman in a suit pointing at a house like it owed her money. Karen rushed to him and launched into her explanation. Emergency authority. Safety risk. Community mandate. The officer listened quietly. Then he asked a single question. Do you have written permission from the homeowner? Karen said permission was implied. The officer looked at me. I said absolutely not. The second patrol car arrived. Then a third. Things shifted. The officer asked Karen to step aside. She refused. She said she was acting in the interest of public safety. She said delaying action could result in fatalities. She said officers would be personally responsible. That was when a fourth vehicle pulled up. It was not a patrol car. It was a government sedan. 2 people stepped out. One of them I recognized immediately. The woman with the pin. She walked over calmly and introduced herself to the officers. She showed credentials. She gestured toward the ladders and reflective panels. She asked who authorized the installation. Karen tried to speak. The woman did not acknowledge her. She asked again. No one answered. She turned to Karen then. She asked if she understood that placing unauthorized visual signals near an active flight path constituted interference with aircraft operations. Karen said she was preventing accidents. The woman said intent did not change outcome. She asked Karen if she had been instructed to cease activity pending investigation. Karen said no one had authority over the HOA. The woman corrected her. She said federal law did. Karen's voice rose. She accused them of overreach. She accused pilots of endangering children. She accused me of manipulating the system. The woman with the pin listened without reacting. Then she said something that finally cut through the noise. She said this was no longer an HOA matter. She said this was now a safety violation. She said enforcement would follow. The officers asked Karen to step away from the property. She refused again. That was when they told her she was trespassing. She laughed. She said she lived in the community. They told her community membership did not grant property rights. The laughter stopped. Karen argued. She gestured. She pointed upward like she always did. The officers repeated the request. She did not comply. They escorted her to the side. One of the HOA workers quietly loaded the ladders back into the truck. The other stood frozen, eyes wide, like he had just realized he was in the wrong movie. Karen did not go quietly. She shouted about lawsuit. She shouted about corruption. She shouted about how everyone would regret this. Phones were out now. Neighbors watched from porches. Someone whispered. Someone else filmed. The officers issued a citation. Then another. The woman with the pin handed Karen a document. I could not hear what was said, but I saw Karen read it. Her face drained of color. She looked at the trucks. She looked at the officers. She looked up at the sky one last time like it might save her. It did not. They told her she needed to leave. She did. As the trucks pulled away and the street returned to its quiet hum, the woman approached me. She said I had done the right thing by calling. She said escalation was unfortunate but necessary. She said the investigation was moving faster now. Mark arrived minutes later. He took in the scene and let out a slow breath. He said that was the moment everything changed. He said Karen had turned imaginary authority into real consequences. That night, an email went out to the entire community. The HOA was suspending all airspace-related actions pending review. The board disavowed unauthorized enforcement. They promised cooperation with authorities. Karen was not mentioned by name. She did not need to be. As I sat on my porch listening to the distant sound of a plane passing safely overhead, I realized the fantasy was cracking. Karen had finally tried to touch the sky. And the sky had pushed back. Karen vanished from public view after that morning, but the damage she had done kept rippling outward like turbulence long after the aircraft passed. The HOA email disavowing airspace enforcement landed in inboxes with a dull thud instead of relief. People did not trust it. Not anymore. Too much had already happened. Too many lines crossed. Silence did not erase videos, citations, or the memory of ladders pointed at a roof like weapons. 2 days later, another message followed. This one was shorter, drier, legal. The HOA board announced it had retained outside counsel. All prior communications regarding airspace were rescinded. Residents were instructed not to interact with Karen in any official capacity. Any further directives from her were to be ignored. That was the moment the story stopped being about airspace. It became about her. Neighbors started talking openly now. Stories surfaced. Someone mentioned Karen threatening fines over mailbox colors. Another recalled her trying to regulate window reflections. A retired engineer brought up a time she claimed authority over sidewalk shadows. At first people laughed. Then they realized a pattern had always been there. Control was her oxygen. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Karen did not accept erasure quietly. She showed up at the airfield. Not the office. The runway perimeter. Security called Mark when she arrived, pacing near the fence line with a folder under her arm. She was demanding to speak to someone in charge. She claimed the HOA had been sabotaged. She claimed pilots were colluding against residents. She claimed she had documentation proving violations. Mark and I arrived together. We did not approach her directly. We watched from a distance as airfield staff spoke with her through the fence. She gestured wildly, pointing at planes taxiing like they were intruders. Her voice carried even from that far away. Then she did something unforgivable. She stepped past the marked boundary. Security moved fast. They ordered her back. She refused. She said she was conducting an inspection. She said the airfield was operating under false assumptions. She said she would shut it down if necessary. A small plane was taxiing nearby. The pilot cut power and signaled. The situation snapped tight in an instant. This was not a meeting room. This was not a driveway. This was live infrastructure. Security escorted her away physically this time. She screamed about rights. She screamed about conspiracies. She screamed my name. Law enforcement arrived minutes later. Statements were taken. Karen was issued a formal warning for trespass on a secured aviation facility. The officer's tone made it clear there would not be a second warning. She left in tears. That evening, the investigation went public. A notice appeared on a federal bulletin site regarding unauthorized interference with aviation operations tied to a residential association. It did not name names, but the details were unmistakable. News outlets picked it up quickly. A local station ran footage. Karen's bright vest made an appearance, blurred but recognizable. Neighbors started calling me. Some apologized. Some thanked me. One asked if I thought property values would recover. I told them honestly that values mattered less than safety. Karen tried to get ahead of it. She sent a mass email from her personal account. She claimed she was being scapegoated. She claimed misogyny. She claimed pilots were silencing community voices. She claimed I was obsessed with her. No one replied. The HOA board removed her from all committees that night. They followed up with a formal suspension pending review of conduct. They cited reputational harm. They cited legal exposure. They cited breach of trust. When the email went out, Mark texted me one word: done. But Karen still had one card left. The next morning, I was served papers. She was suing. Not the HOA. Not the airfield. Me. She claimed defamation. She claimed harassment. She claimed emotional distress. She claimed I had orchestrated a campaign to undermine her authority and ruin her reputation. I read the filing slowly. It was chaotic, rambling, full of screenshots, printed emails, and highlighted phrases ripped from context. It read less like a lawsuit and more like a manifesto. Mark read it and shook his head. He said this was desperation. He said it would not survive first contact with reality. Still, it was real now. Real paperwork. Real court. A week later, we were in a hearing room. Karen sat across from me, smaller than she had ever looked. No vest. No binder. Just a stack of papers clutched too tightly. She glared at me like I had stolen something precious. The judge listened patiently. Asked questions. Read silently. Karen spoke too much. She explained her vision again. Community safety. Shared airspace. Moral authority. She pointed upward once, out of habit, then stopped when she realized where she was. The judge asked her a simple question. On what legal basis did you claim authority over airspace? Karen hesitated. She talked about bylaws. She talked about gray areas. She talked about intent. The judge stopped her. He said intent did not create jurisdiction. He dismissed the case. Just like that. Karen stared at him like he had spoken another language. She opened her mouth to argue. He told her the matter was closed. He warned her about future filings. As we left the room, Karen said nothing. She did not look at me. She walked past like I was air. Outside, Mark exhaled and laughed softly. He said the fall was almost complete. He was right, because the final consequence had not landed yet, and it was coming from the place Karen had tried hardest to control. Above. The letter that ended everything did not come from the HOA, the court, or the airfield. It came from a federal office with a return address Karen had tried to intimidate into silence. I knew what it was the moment I saw it. The investigation findings were finalized. Karen received hers the same day I did, though mine was informational and hers was not. Mine explained outcomes. Hers explained consequences. The difference mattered. The report was thorough, calm, surgical. It documented unauthorized interference with aviation operations, misrepresentation of authority, placement of unapproved visual signals near an active approach path, and repeated refusal to comply with directives once notified. It cited dates, photos, videos, statements, her words, her actions, her insistence that confidence could substitute for jurisdiction. It concluded that she posed an ongoing safety risk. The penalties were not dramatic. They did not need to be. Civil fines. A formal prohibition against engaging in any activity that could be construed as aviation-related enforcement. Mandatory training she would never take. A warning that future violations would escalate quickly. But the real consequence came at the end. A referral. Her name was forwarded to other agencies. Not because of the airspace fantasy itself, but because of the pattern it revealed. Abuse of position. Fabrication of authority. Endangerment. Escalation after warnings. Karen had always believed consequences were something she could redirect at others. This time they stuck. The HOA moved fast after that. Faster than I had ever seen them move on anything. They held a special session and voted to permanently remove her from any leadership role. They updated bylaws to explicitly prohibit unilateral enforcement actions. They issued an apology to residents and the airfield. They hired a real attorney to clean up the mess she left behind. Karen tried to attend the meeting. They did not let her in. She stood outside the community center arguing with a locked door, waving papers no one wanted to read. Someone filmed it. The video made its way around quietly, then loudly. The comments were not kind. They were tired. She stopped coming after that. Weeks passed. Then months. Planes continued to fly overhead, exactly as they always had. Safely. Predictably. Indifferent to human delusion. The sky never changed. Only the noise beneath it did. I ran into Karen once at a grocery store. She looked smaller. Not physically. Spiritually. The confidence was gone. The posture was different. She noticed me and froze like a child caught misbehaving. For a second, I thought she might say something. Apologize. Accuse. Anything. She turned and walked away. Mark later told me she had tried to file complaints with other agencies. Noise boards. Zoning committees. Anyone who might listen. None of them did. Her name carried weight now, but not the kind she wanted. The airfield installed a small plaque near the hangar a few months later. It thanked pilots, inspectors, and community members for cooperation during a safety review. No names. No drama. Just facts. Elena sent me a message after one of her night flights. She said the approach was clean. Clear. Predictable. She said trust mattered more than rules. She was right. Every so often a new neighbor asks about the planes. I tell them the truth. That the airfield was here long before us. That the rules are written in blood, not imagination. That safety does not belong to whoever speaks loudest. They nod. They understand. Or they pretend to. Either way, the system holds. I still think about the moment Karen stood on my driveway pointing at the sky, convinced she could own it if she just tried hard enough. I think about how certainty without knowledge becomes dangerous faster than ignorance ever could. I think about how authority borrowed from fantasy always collapses under real weight. The sky does not care who you are. It does not bend for clipboards, vests, or laminated badges. It does not recognize confidence as currency. It answers only to physics, law, and people trained to respect both. Karen tried to tax the air. In the end, the air exposed her. And it did it quietly, cleanly, and without ever noticing she was there at all.